management-intensive grazing, if you ever read about it, and Jim Garish was the one that coined the term, is not intensive grazing. It's intensive management.
On this edition of the Grass-Fed Homestead, I'm playing my full-length interview with Dr. Woody Lane. Dr. Lane has his PhD from Cornell University in animal nutrition and is the author of Capturing Sunlight. Dr. Lane and I discuss stocking density as well as pasture management, such as management-intensive grazing versus rotational grazing. Dr. Lane, thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I guess it's this afternoon already. Yeah.
I really wanted to get you on the Grass-Fed Homestead because the number one question I get from viewers in regards to sheep is, how many sheep can I have on my land? And then they'll tell me, how many acres they have. And as you know, and as you point out in your book, there's so many variables that go into answering that, and it's going to change depending on the time of the year, like the season, how much rainfall, and so many things. So it's really difficult to help a viewer in that situation without having the knowledge in your book that I've now gained. So prior to getting your book, I'd have to be very general in my answers and try to, give some things for them to think about. But I read in your book a really specific way to go about being able to determine your stocking density, figuring out how many animals you can have on your land. So I would love for you to share some of that with our viewers and help them if they have that same question, how many, and of course, this is not going to be just for sheep. This is going to be for other grazing animals as well. But could you talk to us about how we go about answering that question? How many animals or how many ruminants can I have?
I'm glad you used the word ruminants. This probably would not work if you have a large herd of guinea pigs. I'm not quite sure about that particular thing. But
right.
Yeah, this is, it's obviously a basic thing. And every farm is going to be different in whatever ways they're set up. But there's certain basic principles you can bring to the situation. And using those principles, you can do some very, very fair calculations. They're not hard, but when keeping that in mind gives you a framework in which you can actually answer the question. So let me ask a simple question first, based on, everyone has read whatever they can. I'm sure the people who are reviewing this they've picked up extension bulletins and every book they can and whatever they could, and how to manage the pastures. And what do they say? They say, okay, you got a pasture, and whatever the species are, depends where you are on the continent, but they'll say, when do you put your animals in and when do you take them off? That's a pretty basic question. When do you open the gate and when's it ready to graze, and how quickly do you get them off? And what they'll say is, and we all seen this, put them on at 8 inches and take them off at 2 inches, which is what everyone does, right?
Right, it's always based on length.
Yeah, and that's the standard recommendation about managing pastures. Put them on depends on the species you got. Some species are lower growing than others, so that would put them on at 6 inches, and other species you put them on 8 or 9 inches, and you take them off at 2 or 3 inches, whatever that case is. That's all. It sounds good, but it doesn't work, because I'll ask a question. If we're trying to manage it with animals, it's all right. That's what grazing is all about. You have animals as the way of harvesting that food. I'll ask a question. You've got a sheep, you've got a ewe, and that ewe is lamb a month ago. So she's in early lactation and she's raising twins. Okay. So it's a ewe, whatever that weight is, let's say 160-pound ewe, early lactation and raising twins. All right. And they're going out on spring pasture. My question would be, how many inches of pasture does that ewe need to meet her nutrient requirements?
Right.
And when I ever asked that in a workshop or a class, including a workshop of government agents, there's this blank deer in the headlight look. What do you mean? Well, if you don't know how much inches she's going to eat, how are you going to answer questions like, If I've got a flock of 25 ewes, how long can they stay on this 2-acre pasture? Or, how long will these 5 acres last my flock? And if you can't answer that, how are you going to manage the pasture? And how are you going to make the judgments as to how many animals you can have? Well, it's a change of thinking. And what I do is I teach, and I wrote it in the book, the way that they do it in New Zealand and England, because we don't look at how many inches are out there, because that's not the way we manage animals. When we manage animals, we're going to feed them a certain amount. We don't feed them inches of corn. We feed them pounds of hay or pounds of corn. So we feed them by weight, which is, if you look up the nutrient requirements of the animals, the first thing you have to do is, number one, what animal you're going to feed, and number two, how much are they going to eat? And in that, how much they're going to eat, it's a package, and then we put all the nutrients in that package. And if a ewe is going to eat 6 pounds in a day, well, all the nutrients that meet her requirements are going to have to be in those 6 pounds. Then why don't we work with pastures the same way? Why don't we work the pastures so that we're dealing how much is out there by weight? And if we know how much is out there by weight, or can take a reasonable guess, then we'll be able to say, okay, if my animals eat a certain amount per every day, and I got so many animals, I can kind of match them. And I can say, if these animals are going to eat, 6 pounds a day, and I got 10 animals, that's 60 pounds a day. If I got 1,000 pounds out there, that's going to take me, 15 days to finish that pasture. Now, I'm doing this in my head, and I can't do it as fast in my head. That's why we have calculators. But the basic thing is, once you start to think about the amounts, then you can match the agronomic recommendations with the nutrient recommendations. And then you can have some arithmetic grasp and take an estimate reasonably on how long that pasture is going to last, or how much pasture do you need. And you can do all that before you open the gate.
So, Dr. Lane, if we're not measuring on length of the grass or the forage, and we're looking at weight, it's easy to determine the length. You can do that with a measuring tape. How do we determine the weight of forage, the dry matter forage in the pasture?
Well, here's how we teach it. You take a little area and you cut it to the ground, and then you dry it down, and then you get a certain amount of weight, and then you extrapolate, you know how much weight is for that little area, and then you do some arithmetic and you get how many pounds of dry matter per acre. And I'll show you. If I take something like this, it's a little square. Well, it's not exactly a square. It's a frame. This is a fancy frame. For years, I took a cardboard box and flattened it out, and then I cut out this size. It does the same thing.
And you could also use a rope, right? I think you said in your book of the same length.
I mean, you can use a rope, and I forget the dimensions of that, but I mean, basically and here's the trick is, and you'll see this if it's written up. You'll see, because in the end, what we're going to do is you're going to cut to the ground in this. And then you weigh that. Well, anyway, and then you dry it down in a microwave. And then you end up getting an amount of dry matter that's in, because the rest is water and that doesn't have any protein or energy. So until you got the amount of dry matter that's there, and you got the amount of dry matter in this little square thing, and then some arithmetic will give you how much dry matter is per acre. And if you know your animals are going to eat a certain amount of dry matter per day, bingo, you can match them, on a piece of paper with simple arithmetic. But we've learned how to do this in a very clever way. If you do this, and you'll see some recommendations saying make it a 1 foot by 1 foot or 2 foot by 2 foot. Well, the reason we do it this way is we're not going to do 50 of them to take an average. That's not the idea. I mean, that's what graduate students do, have nothing else to do for their lives. But as a farmer, what you end up doing is you got other things to do, and you have to make this judgment quickly. And what you like to do is be able to make that judgment when you walk out in the pasture and go, how much is out there? Now, there's fancy equipment to kind of help you on that, but basically, when you look at animals or you feel animals in your sheep, you're estimating body condition score, aren't you? I mean, that's a standard thing.
Mhm.
And in sheep, you put your hands on their backbone, right? Well, what you're really measuring is subcutaneous fat.
Right.
But you don't measure subcutaneous fat. What you've done is you're judging how much fat there is through your hands, your fingers, or your eyes if it's got cattle, right? Well, we're trying to do the same thing with forage and pastures. If we do this and get a number, like how much is out there per acre, now I know what that looks like. And so I can do it, and you take pictures of it, and now with the cameras, we got cameras with our phones, take pictures of it, fix that in your mind, and when you get a number, you go, that's what 1,500 pounds looks like on these type of pastures. That's what 3,000 pounds looks like. That's what 200 pounds looks like. And then you can go out in the pasture and take an estimate by just looking at it, which is not unlike putting your hand on the back of a sheep, trying to figure out the body condition score. And the way we do it with this is we don't, to make it real easy, I mean, you can make it a foot by a foot, but then you end up getting a certain number of grams. I'll come back to this. You take that, you dry it in a microwave. You cut it with a shears, one of these. And my tip is get a good one. Because if it's not a good one, you will learn various ways of profanity you had no idea you knew. Because you get one that really cuts well, so you don't have to cut it 4 times to get the grass. All right, and you cut right to the ground because you want to know how much is out there. And then what you end up doing is you're drying this thing down in a microwave, and you put it in your microwave, and you put it for 2 minutes, and you record. You record it, and you weigh it. And what you do is you get a postal scale, simple postal scale, and you go to Bed Bath & Beyond and get one for about $20, $15. That measures to the nearest gram. It's important to get to the nearest gram and not the nearest 5 grams or 10 grams. You need 1 gram. And when you cut the grass, you put them in a bag. You weigh the bag just so you know what your background weight is, right? Then you put the stuff in the bag, and then you dry it down. And then each time you dry it down, you take it some more weight. You take more weight, take it again. Like the first time you dry it for 2 minutes, then 2 minutes, then 1 minute, then 1 minute, 1 minute, and you just measure it. And you might start out with 50 grams, and then it drops down to 30 grams, then 22 grams, then 15 grams, and 14 grams, and eventually 14, 14, 14. Yeah, bingo! You've gotten all the water out. So you got 14 grams. And then you weigh this first, so you knew that was 7 grams, which in this particular, I've done them enough so I know that this one's about 7 grams. But so let's say you had 14 grams, but you had the bag of 7 grams, so now you only got really 7 grams of stuff in there. Okay, so you got 7 grams of dry matter, and if it was a foot by a foot, you'd have 1 square foot. And you got to take 7 grams of dry matter for 1 square foot. And you got to do a whole bunch of calculations, and then you get how many pounds per acre. Well, we made it easy. If you take this thing here, and instead of doing a foot by a foot, do 12 inches by 11.5 inches. And if you do that, this has got 138 square inches. I'm coming back to your circle in a moment. You end up having 138 square inches. If you weigh everything down and you got 7 grams in this 138 square inches, so what you've got is 7 grams per 138 square inches. And now we have to translate that into pounds per acre. But if this is 138 square inches, you do the calculations, and all you have to do is take that number 7 and multiply it by 100, which means all you have to do is add 2 zeros. So by doing this at 12 by 11.5 inches, and then you throw it out there and you cut it down and you dry it down and you get a number, let's say it's 15, then you've got 1,500 pounds per acre. If you got 22, you got 2,200 pounds per acre. So you don't, once you get this squared away, so to speak, you don't have to do the calculations anymore. You just add 2 zeros, which you just do that. Now, you need 138 square inches. That's the trick. So go back to your basic algebra that we learned, or geometry way back when, 200 years ago, and figure out what size circle will give you what perimeter of the circle will give you 238 square inches, and that's your piece of rope. So if you want to do a circle, you can do that. I don't have it in the top of my head, but that's all it means. You get 138 square inches, and in the end, the number of grams per 138 square inches, and you end up with just add 2 zeros. And
That's awesome.
It doesn't get much easier than that once you got this squared away. And a farmer figured that out. I was using a foot by a foot, and he came up to me and said, "Hey, Woody, instead of doing 12 inches by 12 inches, why don't you do 12 by 11 and a half?" And then we sat and we worked it out and said, "By Jove, that is clever."
Nice.
Anyways, so then you end up with a certain amount.
Right. So in this example, if we're using the 7 grams, we're multiplying by 100 and we're given the number 700. So what does that tell us about our pasture? Because we want to leave, in your book, you mentioned, we want a residual. We don't want to scalp the pasture down to the soil. So we want some grass left. And we wanted to put them on the grass, or I keep saying grass. What I mean is forage.
Forage, whatever's out there.
And we're putting them on the forage at a certain time. So how does that number 700 translate into that grass growth curve that we're looking for? Like where we're starting them, where we're finishing them?
Well, that's the real question. This whole thing of trying to get the idea of how much is there is a preparatory thing, but it makes you think about it. It gives you the number you can work with. This isn't like, oh, we got 5 inches of grass. Because in reality, if you got 5 inches of grass, how dense is it? Makes all the difference in the world. Well, the amount of pounds is what the animals are eating. And that depends on the density, but you're not going to measure it. You're just going to measure what they're going to eat. So you got 700 pounds. Now it comes back to how forages grow. And what we end up doing, and I'm sure you will put a growth curve up there in your graphic, is essentially we have a growth that looks like an S. If you think of an x-axis and a y-axis graph, and the x-axis is time, going from weeks, how many weeks it is, but in the y-axis is the amount up there, the total, what we call the total mass. So let's just say you have a total, let's come back a moment. Let's say you have a total mass of 3,000 pounds. You measured that out and it was like, it was 30 grams, and you multiply it by 100, you get 3,000 pounds per acre. Good. Now 3,000 pounds an acre is 1.5 tons of stuff out there, and of dry matter. You're not going to graze it down till you scalp it. There might be times you want to, but normally in a normal situation, you don't want to do that. You want to leave some stuff there so the plants will grow back. Mm-hmm. And what we call it in the grazing world, that's the residual. That's the amount that you leave there. That's extremely important because those are the solar panels that are going to have to feed the plants so they can grow again. And if you scalp it too much, you don't have many solar panels, so it's going to take a long time to come back. And you might put so much stress on certain plants that they die out. So you've got let's say that 3,000 pounds an acre is your total amount that's out there. We call it the total mass. And then the residual, you say, well, how many pounds? Well, on the average, rule of thumb is you want to leave 1,000 pounds, which can translate to 2 or 3 inches, basically. But let's say it's 1,000 pounds. So if you start with 3,000 and you end up with 1,000, the stuff the animals are going to eat is the stuff in the middle. That's 2,000 pounds per acre we're talking about. Okay, so if you have 2,000 pounds, let's do a calculation. That's the amount of material that's out there that I can put my animals on. Now, if they eat 3,000 pounds, they will eat it right to the ground. So the amount that they can eat is what we call the available mass. That's the amount that they actually can eat under management. So let's say you had 1 acre has got 2,000 pounds of available mass. That's the amount they can eat. So if you take let's say you have 125 ewes, which is kind of a large size, but some people have it, all right? If you figure a ewe is 160 pounds, and this is an important number, and this is a number that anyone can guess at. Let's say she eats 5% of her body weight. Now, actually, she eats less than that, but she's going to trample some, okay? She's going to trample some, and if she's got a couple of lambs on her, they might eat a little bit, we're not going to worry about those details. We're just going to take a little bit of an extra guess and say 5% of body weight. Now, as people get used to it, 4% will be working, but the principle is exactly the same. And I take 5% because it makes the numbers easier as well. So if they got a 160-pound ewe at 5% of her body weight, that's going to be 8 pounds. That means one ewe is going to eat 8 pounds of dry matter a day. So if you got 125 ewes, they're going to graze 1,000 pounds. 8 times 125 is 1,000. Now we said that pasture has got 2,000 pounds of available grass, from 3,000 to 1,000, so you got 2,000 pounds. So I got my 125 ewes and they eat 1,000 pounds a day. How many days can they stay out there? 2. They're out there 3, I'm down to the ground. So if they stay out there 2, the flip side is if I have a 3-acre field like that, how long will it last? Well, if they eat 2,000 pounds in 2 days, it'll take them 6 days to finish the pasture. And I can do that calculation before I open the gate to put the ewes out there. Or conversely, I can set a fence, an electric fence up ahead, so I know how much they need to have. Now, what happens if I'm wrong? Well, then I either go through too fast, or after 6 days, there's too much feed left. Well, then I've learned, okay, maybe my initial guess was not good, and I'll adjust my initial guess. And like everything else, with experience, you learn, and you get this feedback all the time. And pretty soon you're setting the gates, the far fence, closer and closer to where it really needs to be. But keep it in mind that you're balancing how much is out there with how much they're going to eat. And you have numbers for both ends of that. And that gives you the power to make reasonable judgments as to how long they're going to be out there.
And for the person who's just getting into grazing, maybe they're a beginning homesteader,
Sure.
and they're not sure how many animals to start with. This can help them determine how many animals can their land really support, so they're not going to bring in too many animals and overgraze, or if they're being maybe too cautious, and they could maybe bring in some more, depending on that forage quality. And it's really really big guesswork just to base it on acreage, as a lot of people's, how many acres? Well, you can fit it, in general, X amount of animals per acre. And it's like, that's not really the right way to do it. But with your method, they can know within a very tight margin of error how many animals that their land can support. And
Dan, it gets a little more complex than that. That's the basic principle.
Mm-hmm.
But on a real farm, you have 365 days a year.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on where you are in the country, but at certain times there's going to be more forage, there's going to be less forage. And over time, people improve the amount of forage by adding fertility to the soil. So how many animals that property can support is a moving target, mainly because the animals got to eat. How much feed can you raise under the conditions that make good sense and keep the forages going? And that's going to change over time as you get better at managing forages, and also weather. You get a drought, that changes the world in a hurry. So but at least this gives understanding the amount they're going to eat and the amount that's out there, gives you a handle on how in some way to match them. And if you could say, okay, I have 10 acres and I have 10 acres and I can raise, let's say 2 tons of hay. Let's say 2 tons, I'm just going to do this off the top of my head. Sure. Let's say I get 2 tons of hay per acre. I got 10 acres. Okay, that's 20 tons of hay. So 20 tons of hay, but hay is not 100% dry matter. Let's say it's 90% dry matter. So that means that you got 18 tons of dry matter. Mm-hmm. So 18 tons is 36,000. 18 times 2,000 is 30 times 2,000 is 36,000 pounds. All right. If you have 36,000 pounds, and let's say your ewes eat 6 pounds a day, you got 600 days. Well, 36,000 divided by 6 6,000 days. You have 6,000 U days. But that you don't, because that would be a mistake. And the reason I mean a mistake is you're not accounting for the residual. When you make hay, someone makes hay, it cuts it pretty much to the ground. You got only 200-300 pounds residual. So you won't have 6,000 U days. You probably have 4.5. But the fact is that you have the concept of the amount they're going to eat versus the amount that is growing. And if you can add a lot of compost, for example, and increase that from 6,000 to 7,000, that's a big jump. And some fields will increase, other fields it won't, and you can make these judgments. But you're always thinking in terms of amounts of what's growing and the amounts the animal's going to eat. And that's how the New Zealanders think. I had a farmer that I went to New Zealand a number of years ago, and when she came back, she said what she really learned, and she was a very, very good grazer here in the United States, in Oregon, and said the thing they learned is the tool that those farmers use in New Zealand, the biggest tool they use is their calculator. And that was an eye-opener. And it was based exactly on the principles we're talking about right now.
So Dr. Lane, you mentioned just a moment ago about the moving target of the pastures over the course of a year, because obviously in spring, forage is growing much more quickly than we're in the Northern Hemisphere here where we're recording. So in August, that's a very dry time of the year. In summer, late summer. So forage really isn't growing noticeably at that point. So that's what you're referring to, I think, when you said that moving target. But that also reminds me of another part in your book where you talked about rotational grazing, because rotational grazing is this very popular concept, especially in the sustainable regenerative ag movement. And it's the highlight of a lot of different presentations, a lot of books that I've read. But in your book, you said something interesting that, well, I'll let you talk about it. Can you talk about rotational grazing, your thoughts on it, and maybe what a better solution is?
There is. And I'm going to surprise some people. When I teach classes and courses, there are basically 3 types of grazing management. The first one is what you've seen everywhere. It's what we call set stocking, which is you put the animals out on a pasture and come back in a few years and take them off the pasture, right? I mean, they're just out there. They're not moving around. I mean, there's no fencing or anything. They go wherever they want, and that pasture could be 3 acres. It could be 50 acres. It depends on the size of the operation. But basically, you're not doing anything except opening the outside gate, letting them in, and then leaving them there. Think about what that does. And this is so critical. If animals are on a piece of property, well, animals are like everybody else. They're going to eat chocolate over broccoli, most likely. They're going to eat the stuff they want to eat first. Well, they're walking around and they're looking for stuff to eat. Well, have you ever, Dan, have you ever sat and watched grass grow?
Not personally.
It's exciting. But in all seriousness, it's more exciting than watching paint dry. Let me tell you that.
Okay.
For those of us who are into forages, this is a big deal. But no, seriously, if you let's say you cut grass. I'm not talking about any forages, but grass, for example. You cut it, or it's mowed in a lawn or something like that. From the time you do it, how long does it take? And let's say there's good fertility there. You're not in the desert. Reasonable fertility. You got growing and you got enough moisture. So how long does it take from the time it gets cut before you start seeing green shoots again?
I don't know.
4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days. Maybe 6 or 7, but 4 or 5 days would be typical. All right, so you got these little green shoots that are added to what we call regrowth. It's the growth back. It's the regrowth of the plants. So if you're an animal out there, if you're a sheep, a goat, cow, and you're walking around looking to eat, and you come across the regrowth compared to the older growth, do you look at that and go, I better wait on that one. I'll come back when it's a little higher? If you're a sheep. Have you ever seen a sheep step back from anything?
No.
No, they're going to eat it. that means they're eating the regrowth. That means that that plant that's out there, as it's trying to grow back, bang, gets hit. And since it's trying to grow back, it doesn't have many solar panels on it yet. So what it's doing is pulling out of reserves. It starts pulling out of reserves and gets hit. And then the animal walks away. But a few days later, it comes back and does it again. And it does it again. After a while, that plant never really got a good start again, and it's weakened, and the first time some nematode or bug comes along, and that plant's going to die. Unless, of course, that plant is so unpalatable that the animal doesn't want to eat it, in which case it matures and sets seed and takes over the pasture, like a weed. So set stocking, what it does is basically destroy your best plants, or puts certainly pressure on their best plants. So they kind of fade out. And you're always struggling with weeds and less palatable plants and plants that will handle that type of grazing. Things that grow low to the ground, usually have rhizomes or stolons, like Kentucky bluegrass, for example, and can handle that, that basically a continuous overgrazing. So that's what's called set stocking. And then someone came up with the idea years ago, I mean like 50 years ago at this point, said, let's put some fences around back and forth across the field so that we can move the animals from place to place and therefore give plants a rest. So if you take a field and run one fence down it, 50% of the time the plants don't get eaten, so they got a 50% rest. And then you can start with a box and you can make more and more fencing, and you end up getting, let's say you have 16% or 12. Let's say you have 12 different paddocks. You got they're eating just 88% of the time they're resting, and it looks really nice on a blackboard or whiteboard. You have this square, and you make these little, you cut the square into halves and quarters and eighths and sixteenths, that type of thing. And then you move the animal from one square to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. That's called rotational grazing. And it might be only a couple of paddocks, it might be a lot of paddocks. The point is, and you move them around very neatly. And that sounds good, because the more paddocks you make, the more percentage of the time that there's nothing in those paddocks. So you might have 16 paddocks, and you spend 2 days in each one. It takes you 32 days to get back to paddock number one again. And that looks really good. And that's called rotational grazing. Most of the people who try that after a while give up. And the reason they give up, it's not that it doesn't work, but it's not the extra forage that you get on that doesn't really justify all the extra time and labor to do what you're doing. Why doesn't it work? I'm not saying rotational grazing doesn't work, but the way that is classically taught, it does not work. It's kind of a cookie cutter thing. Because how many farms do you know are exactly the same across the whole farm? Because the assumption of a whiteboard is not that the farm's square, but the fact is that every paddock is exactly the same, so that when you come back in 32 days, you're at the right part of the growth curve.
Right. Some paddocks are going to be more lush than others, depending on their proximity to a creek, or if there's shade from trees, your forage growth is going to be different.
If you've got a little reed canary grass in there, you've got a lot of clover in there, the soils may be drier in one part of the farm than the other. I mean, this is the reality. The farms aren't whiteboards. And so different parts of the farm are going to grow, and over the course of the growing season. A paddock may be a south-facing slope. So in the spring, it's really going to take off. The north-facing slopes are going to be cooler and high. Soils that tend to be wetter are going to be colder. So that's going to be delayed growth. Okay, this is normal. So how can rotational grazing in the classic sense of moving things around like a cookie cutter doesn't take that into account. So what happens when you do that is that various times you're getting into the paddock when there's really not enough grass not enough growth for whatever reason, but you've got 2 days, you got to be in there. And in those 2 days, those animals eat they overeat. They eat into the residual. And that paddock has been hurt. Other times, if you waited too long to get to a paddock, you know, it's like old growth tall fescue. You got to use a chainsaw to be able to graze the thing, because it waited too long, because that paddock was, you know, in May with really fertile ground is simply 32 days too long. Well, there's a third way of grazing, and that's what we call management intensive grazing, which is, a lot of people think management intensive grazing is taking these small little areas, moving animals around, intensively grazing. Management intensive grazing, if you ever read about it, and Jim Garish was the one that coined the term, is not intensive grazing. It's intensive management. Mm-hmm. Animals always graze intensively. You take some sheep and their lambs, okay? Let's, for example, and let's say you have a field, I mean, you have a farm, and they go out into a field, and there's a patch of clover in that field, okay? Again, have you ever seen those lambs and ewes go up to the patch of clover and the ewes step back to let the lambs go first?
No.
Not in our world. So everyone grazes intensively all the time. And what we do is we use them as the harvesting units to harvest the feed that have captured the sunlight. So what we do in management intensive grazing is we use intensive management. It's a thinking person's type of grazing. Because what you do is you have an area that they're going to graze in, and you set the fence, or the electric fence, at a certain distance to cover 2 days worth of feed, or 3 days or 4 days, whatever sits. You know, in a dairy farm, they might do it 12 hours because they're moving animals every 12 hours, whatever fits. With one, and you do that, and then you do it to the next one, and you do it to the next one. So the paddocks don't look all the same. There's ways of setting things up so that they're at least in a line, but they don't look the same. But the amount of space you give, you might have 5 goats. During the part of the year, I get about 20, 25, or 30 sheep that come on my property. And what I do is I do exactly that. The paddocks aren't the same. I'm going to put the fence a little further out, a little further back, depending on the growth at that time. And I can move the animals around from area to area based on how, and I say I want to move them every couple of days, 2 days, 3 days. That's my own personal experience. But then I get out there in 3 days and go, there's still a lot more extra there. They're not even down to where I want them to go at 1,000 pounds. I'll leave them there an extra day. Or I go out there and go, oh my gosh, I need to move them right now. But I can, because I'm not fixed in some sort of locked in schedule. What I'm doing is I'm managing the forage using the animals to do that. I'm allocating feed for a certain number of days. And then we put a couple of rules on that. One of which is I call the 5-day rule. And that comes back to watching grass grow. I don't want my animals out there eating new growth. I'm going to protect that residual no matter what. And I want them off that piece of the land when that new stuff comes in, because I want it to grow back. And so I call that a 5-day rule based on the fact that in 5 days, you're going to start to see regrowth. So I want the animals off that. So set stocking isn't having animals out on a paddock for 6 months. It's having them out there for more than 5 days. Because what they're doing is eating regrowth. And so they protect the regrowth. And so that's what we do is you move the animals around to where they need to be. And the size of the fence, the size of the area, because you set it with electric fence, helps that, because you can control the animals and you control the size of the paddock or the grazing cell with that. And sure, if someone's got 5,000 ewes or 250 or 300 cows, they're not going to. They have to work the thing. The concept is there, but they're not necessarily moving fence all the time because it's the size of the operation. But someone who is in a homesteading situation where they've got 20 sheep, absolutely useful, completely doable. And plus, the sheep, when they sheep or goats or even cows, you do that a couple of times and they know what you're doing. So you come out that time of day and you need to open the little gate to get them in the next place. You don't have to drive them; they go. You get out of their way, and they just flow nicely. There's no stress on anybody. And then you close the gate. And it takes them about 3 days to learn, 3 or 4 times to move, and they're training you really well. So that's the difference. There's 3 types of grazing. basically a set stocking, which is eating regrowth, a classic rotational grazing, which is everything squared out and everything's the same, and then the management intensive grazing. And let me just say that in the scientific world, in other words, scientists who have to run controlled experiments and then publish those experiments, that's the nature of the scientific world, and that's good. But when it comes to grazing, they have to do rotational grazing because they have to be able to describe their the experiments so other people can do it. They can say, well, we had 16 grazing cells. We moved the animals every 2 days, and therefore we had 32-day cycle.
In the
They can write that
rotational
out.
in the rotational grazing model, what I hear you saying is basically they're eliminating the variables and having them set controls that are repeatable theoretically,
And that others can copy it.
right. Whereas the management intensive grazing, there are so many variables that it's not scientifically you can't do the studies on it the same way because it's not a
Not in the same
repeatable
way, exactly. And
yeah.
the way I kind of relate it to is play a basketball game. I mean, you learn the principles, but once you get on that court, the other teams out there, you're going to use those principles, but you're shifting back and forth and you're changing things. And the game progresses. That's what you're doing with a pasture. Editors of scientific journals don't like that.
Right.
You say, I changed everything to make well, actually, they can do it that way if that is the entire treatment. But that's beyond the scope of this. But that requires you to be skilled. And that's the reality of being on a farm. Science is different. Nothing wrong with science. And I'm a trained scientist and I've published material. But when we get out into a farm, homestead, large farm, small farm, we have to deal with things that are changing.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to, if we can use the principles of forage growth, the principles of good grazing, and knowing how to deal with it in terms of amounts of stuff, and know how to measure that in a general way, and then apply those numbers, we have tools to play that basketball game a lot better than we did before. That's what it comes down to.
Yeah, absolutely. And like
That's
these
what's in my
topics,
book.
yeah. So I was about to just mention that like, these topics that we hit on today were just tip of the iceberg on all the other stuff that's going on in your book. There's what we talked about and so much more. It is a very comprehensive pasture management book. I cannot recommend it enough. I'm not all the way through it yet, but for how much good information and the scientific approach to the information is in there, it's actually a really easy read too. It's that perfect balance of that quality, that the density. It's very information dense, but at the same time being very palatable to a casual reader. It's not super dry like scientific journals would be. It's nothing like that. So
I wrote what amounts to is the book is a collection of essays or articles. All of those articles were written over years for the Shepherd magazine. I still write a monthly column for it. And so I took those articles that fit this book, and there's 62 articles plus another 30 pages of a textbook, and then they're in categories, So each one of those articles is a chapter about 1,000, 1,500 words. But it was written for you and me. I mean, it was written so it was a magazine article. It's been copy edited, which is disturbing because then you have an English teacher standing over your head. But the end result is that I meant them to be readable, and in bite-sized chunks, if you will, but scientifically sound, and trying to establish exactly what we're talking about here.
Where can our viewers or listeners go to, one, learn more about you and maybe get in touch with you if they have any questions, and then two, where can they get your new book, Capturing Sunlight?
I'll answer both of them. I have a website called woodylane.com. Very straightforward, and that describes who I am and whatever, and also describes the books I have out. I have one on nutrition as well. And it's very easy to go to Amazon. Just type my name into the search box and the book will come up, Woody Lane. And it comes right up on the top. I just did it myself.
Perfect. And I'll leave links below in the video description for this, but for those of you, some people can't access that from their phones or different devices, don't necessarily have that. So for those listening, I would just wanted to get that out there as well. So
You have the Kindle edition. It comes as a paperback as well, a trade paperback as well.
right, yeah, I have the ebook, but there's the print copy as well. Dr. Lane, thank you so much for joining us. I hope that we can maybe in the future continue the discussion.
Well, Dan, it's a pleasure. I'm really glad we had a chance to have this discussion, and thank you for asking.
Absolutely, thank you.